right, good morning, good evening, wherever this is reaching you at. It's the Put the Word on It podcast, co-host Austin Lewis.
I'm Pastor Knighton.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So we got another great show for you all. Gonna look at a show talking about the recent shootings that we've seen. You know, I think it's over 15 already here in the month of March. You know, that we've seen these mass shootings.
Right.
You know, these, particularly in the schools that we've got, and we had the the student protesting the gun control law. So it's a lot of back and forth about, is guns the issue? Do we need to have stricter gun laws? How do we stop this? Why is God allowing these innocent children to die? And so on this show, we just want to, obviously we want to put the word on and go at it from that perspective. But, maybe I want to talk about how we minister to these people that have lost loved ones, and how, what can we do to change this? Why is this happening?
I think there's a couple of things. Number one, I think as we look at, how do we stop this or why is this even happening? Actually, the answer is the same as to why it's happening and how do we stop this. And that is that we have to stop sinning. The only reason these things exist is because sin is in the world. As we've talked about on other audio shows, maybe not on video shows, but we've talked about, look, the bottom line is this, that the moment from the Garden of Eden, and I know some people don't want to hear that, but this is a Put the Word on the show. From the Garden of Eden, God taught us a very valuable lesson that really we should adhere to always. And that is the moment we choose to go away from God, then we become responsible for things that we ultimately can't handle. That's why God told them, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in that day you shall surely die. So they go from really having an opportunity at eternal life, because if you read the text, the tree of life was present in the garden, of which one of them that they were permitted to eat from.
Right.
So, but they chose to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. At that point, now humanity now takes on a sin nature. Now the world is now what we call broken or fallen. So now, as a part of a fallen or broken world, we now have this infection or this virus, this airborne virus, if you will, that now exists called sin, and then the consequences of sin.
Right.
While people say, well, wait a minute, this is 2018, why are you going all the way back to the garden? Because that's where it starts, and that is really ultimately where it stops. Because we still have the right to free will choice, because in order for love to be genuine, we must have choice. Right. That's why God gave it to us. So here's my thing is we need to choose the tree of life still.
Right.
And that tree of life is Jesus Christ. Now, does that mean that it's going to stop the sin in the world? He has already defeated sin for all eternity. It's up to us to now make sure we are living righteously before him. Now, but to make that make sense, for many is we have to place blame where blame belongs.
Right.
So first of all, the mass shootings are, the first person you blame is the shooter.
Right.
Or shooters. Because while I know people want to get into gun laws, I know people want to get into those kind of things, but ultimately the law is made for the lawbreakers. So whether you have stricter gun control to somebody who doesn't abide by the law, it doesn't really matter what you do. I'm still going to go get my gun.
Right.
And if my heart is set to sin and do wrong and harm those who have not even harmed me, then I'm still going to do it. Yes, you can make me jump through more hoops. You can make it harder. But the truth of the matter is, if it wasn't guns, in the days before there were guns, there were swords.
Right.
In the days after that, there's going to be bombs.
Exactly.
So here's the thing. When God looked upon, when he destroyed the world by water, it says that God looked upon the earth and saw that man, as in humans, hearts were bent on evil, I'm paraphrasing, to do evil all the time.
Right.
Well, God, again, not only told us not to eat, in other words, not disobey, but then God wipes it away, gives us an opportunity, and yet we still continue to do this. So the bottom line is that this starts and stops in the same place where there's sin, of which we've all contributed to spreading this virus throughout the world. The first thing I would say to every one of us, me included first, let us minimize our contribution to sin in the world by first coming to Jesus Christ and then living for him and honoring him with our lives.
Okay.
Now, let's go back to specifics. Specifics is very simply this. is that as long as sin is in the world, we're going to have brokenness, we're going to have fallenness, we're going to have all of these kinds of things that take place. But people have free will choice. The shooter have free will choice. And unfortunately, my free will choice or somebody's free will choice can impact my life, right? So whether it's the gun, and we talked about this a little bit before the show, when it comes to gun laws, if the gun to the parents and the victims, because I do want to talk about how we comfort them and minister to them, is, it doesn't matter whether the gun was bought legally or illegally when your child is dead.
Right.
Your child is gone. So whether the shooter got the gun legally or illegally, it doesn't really matter. So I know we need to have proper gun laws. Yes, you can, you got to be 21 in the state of Florida to buy alcohol. You should be 21 to be able to license and carry a gun. Trust me, there are still 15-year-old gangbangers who going to have guns. Right. But that's not going to limit it. But, from a legal standpoint, yes, that's fine. That may make people feel better about it. It may make one or two people not necessarily buy a gun or have access to a gun, but that doesn't change the fact that they still have free will choice and people are still going to take guns and they're still going to try to harm life. Because, again, we see a lot of that in places where we have not embraced God, we've pushed God out.
Right. Now, and I had a question.
Sure.
With the gun piece, so because we're talking about the laws now. So say we do make the laws stricter. Does that necessarily change anything though? Because to me, it's looking like it's a cultural thing. It's obviously it's a whole world thing. With sin nature, but doing the research, it's like we don't see these numbers in other countries. We don't see this, taking place in other countries. We see it happen at a very alarming rate in in America.
Right.
And do you think that has anything to do with with us being a nation that claimed that that God was our God, and now as we see it, we're kind of pushing him further and further away?
Well,
do you think this?
I think that there is. Well, first of all, there's definitely a correlation to that, to some of the things that even God, as God sits in His sovereignty on the throne, that perhaps God allows because of the fact that we have been very clear to God, not me, not you, but society has been very clear to God. We don't want you in schools because we don't want prayer in schools. We don't want anything offered up religiously in schools. And as I've said, if that day I had walked up as a pastor, if you had walked up as one who was called in ministry and said, listen, I'd like to go in and bring everybody into the gym. We want to have a prayer meeting and we want to call up on the name of Jesus to protect this school because there are 17 souls that need to be saved in this house today. That school district, they would have called the police to come get you off the premises because they said there's no way in the world we're going to allow you to do that. Now, that's not being insensitive to what went on. I'm just stating the reality of what would have happened prior to that.
Right.
So we've told God, we don't want you in marriage because we're going to define marriage in this country. We don't want you, God, in our schools because we're not going to pray to you in our schools. We don't want any mention of you. Even the silent moment of meditation is still come against by people. Yeah. Even, God, we really don't want you in the Pledge of Allegiance in this country because we have asked people to take out one nation under God.
Right.
So the bottom line is we have continued to push God to the side and say we don't want you involved. But when we see a tragedy, the first thing we say is, but where was God?
Right.
So what God is saying is very simply is that you should include me and then watch me do what I do. Now, on top of that, we'll never know until Judgment Day how many school shootings God did stop, how many lives God really did save already. We see 17 when truthfully already there have been numerous school shootings already, and here we are in March 2018. So part of that issue is very simply is that we have certainly pushed God out. Now, here's the other thing that's within this country of which I'm born, raised in America. I love America. Love the red, white, and blue. America don't do everything right, but it still don't change that I don't love it. Just like your family. Mm-hmm. Family don't do everything right, but they still your family, right? Yeah. So my thing on that is very simply this. I think once we start changing laws, here's where America's not going to go like other countries where they're going to have just straight, strict laws about guns and only certain people having like military. I personally have a gun, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But part of the issue is people want to come out against stricter gun laws. But here's where America's going to have this rub. A lot of people will do that now. Until then, there starts to be an infringement on other rights. See, because there's a lot of people who are like, well, I really don't carry a gun, so it don't really matter to me if they have stricter gun laws. I have no use for that. I got small kids in the house. I don't want a gun, whatever. But then when they start infringing upon other rights in America, you got students just this week here in Georgia, walked out of class for 17 minutes, I believe, or whatever it was, in honor of the 17 victims in the Florida school shooting to protest gun violence and to ask for, greater protections in schools. Right. You got a lot of politicians, and I want to look at the camera when I say this, you got a lot of politicians who are against guns and want more gun control, but they are protected by Secret Service, bodyguards, and people of that nature who are armed. If you really, really feel that way and you got great conviction about it, tell your security detail to de-arm themselves. Okay, I'll leave that alone. Y'all can think about that for a minute. But the truth of the matter is this. We've got to come to a place where we realize that the law is for lawbreakers. Yes, we can make the laws make sense. I personally, I'll say this right now. I personally have no need for an assault rifle. I just don't. I carry a gun. I carry a gun at church on Sundays because there have been church shootings. I'm the pastor of this church. I'm going to protect this church. I'm going to protect the flock. I plan, and I hope I never ever have to use a weapon. But the truth of the matter is that to have it for self-defense is actually biblical. Jesus himself says in the scripture, Luke 22, 35 through 38, let alone the laws, because we know we can go to Romans 13:1 that, governing laws are established by God, things of that nature.
Right.
Then Jesus asked them, in Luke 22, 35 through 38, he says, then Jesus asked them, when I sent you without purse, bag, or sandals, did you lack anything? Nothing, they answered. He said to them, but now, if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag, and if you do not have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. That's a weapon. It is fulfilled, he says, and it is written, he was numbered with the transgressors, and I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me. Yes, what is written about me is reaching its fulfillment. The disciple said, see, Lord, here are 2 swords. That's enough, he replied. So Jesus even allowed the folk around him to have weapons. As a matter of fact, he said at the time when they were arresting him to crucify him, that now was the time for them to, even if they didn't have one, to sell their cloak and go buy one.
Right.
So having or possessing it is never the issue. It's about what I do with it once I get it. And This goes back to our fundamental point on this show. We're going to put a word on it. It's not about necessarily what people do. It's about until hearts change and turn their hearts to be like Christ, we're going to constantly and continually always have these kinds of issues.
Right. And we talked about that earlier, and I told you about what I was reading, and it wasn't even coming from a Christian standpoint, but it's just from a logical standpoint. They were just saying, it's not the guns, it's the fact that it's the violent people that, it's the nature of the people that has this violent, evil nature that has the guns, that wants to go forth and do these things. And as we talked about, America, we've kind of made this, the society has made this this breeding ground of violence. We see it in so many different aspects of our lives, like we talked about Grand Theft Auto, teaching you how to go out there, get a pimp, get a hoe, get all these different guns. If we look at, just all the different TV shows and all the different movies, you want to say it's action, that's one thing, okay, but still that doesn't take away the fact that we're getting driven and hit with violence, and the fact that our culture so clearly loves this violent stuff, but then we want to get mad at it. So that, to me, that's one thing to look at, and that's not even from, a necessarily biblical perspective, but just if we just look at the society itself and we look at the violent nature. I was reading something about the, I think his name was Nicholas Cruz, the shooter in Florida, and one of the things that he said afterwards was about how he wanted to, how he was going to ditch the bag and do something where he blended in with the crowd. And it immediately made me think to this movie that I watched. I think it was Taken 3, and how the guy Liam Neeson, he went in there and he pulled the fire alarm, and everybody in the crowd started running out, and he did this thing, he did something to where he just blended in with the crowd and was able to get out. So to me, I say that just to say that little things like that, people take and they go out and they act on that. That like we have different movies and stuff that's kind of teaching people how to do these things. I'll look at my own life and like, you know, when I'm, you know, just thinking about, okay, well, what if XYZ was to happen here? You know, just thinking like, okay, so if I'm at this light here, what will I do? Or if somebody were to do something, and I kind of think back to something I maybe saw in a movie or something as a means to go forward. So it's like that stuff impacts, you know, the way that people do the things that they do. So
Absolutely. I think what happens is, and I think a lot of people don't want to we don't want to take responsibility and ownership for the fact that we have indoctrinated an entire generation that violence is okay, and that somebody just dies, then oh well. Because I flip the channel and then I go on and I watch the next movie, or on the video game as I get to different levels by how many people I kill, or what I do, how much I acquire, how much crime I commit. And people don't have a problem with necessarily kids sitting in front of a video screen or a TV screen playing these games and being indoctrinated with violence, and that I solve problems with violence. And so as a matter of fact, even me being much older than Austin is obviously, you know, one of the most violent sports that I'd ever seen growing up was obviously probably boxing and or, you know, football. And even now football is taking the stance to make it safer, even though it's still a violent collision sport. But boxing was, but now boxing seems soft compared to MMA. Because there's this thirst and this hunger for greater violence, for bloodshed, for all of these things. So now what we see is you don't get to play with sin and then figure that none of the consequences are ever going to come my way. And so that's why I'm saying we still are going to start and end in the same place, that because sin is in the world, that all of us get infected and affected by it. So the reason why I use the analogy of a virus is, you know, if a virus comes into this room, Colin's behind the camera, Colin might get a runny nose, I might get a sore throat, Austin might get a cough, Marcus might get body aches. You know, everybody's going to affect. So now that sin is in the world, we're all going to get impacted and affected by it differently, and we're going to all have proclivities that we're going to want to do things that are not of God. But that's why the word tells us don't use our freedom as a cover up for sin, or don't make provisions for our flesh. And what we've said is, okay, well, in my flesh, this is something I like to do, so the government shouldn't tell me what to do with it. The government can regulate it. That's fine. There's nothing wrong in that. You can jump through and go through hoops. But I promise you right now, if I had a police officer sitting right in here right now, he would tell you that many of the people that he may stop, their guns aren't necessarily legally attained or acquired. So what that tells you is that guns are still, as long as they're manufactured, it doesn't matter what laws you put in place, criminals are still going to have guns. The reason why schools are such huge targets is because they are normally gun-safe zones. And shooters view them as soft targets. So there has to be a place where you have to realize that there has to be a level of protection put up because of the realities of the world we live. Yes, there should be some stricter gun laws. You shouldn't be able to buy a gun and not be able to buy alcohol in the state of Florida. And Florida's my home state, so I'll be the first to say that. But the truth of the matter is that, but I still know if I need to get a gun, probably where I can go and maybe get one, whether I'm 21 or not. And that becomes the greater issue. So until hearts change and turn to want to do right, we're going to face these kinds of situations always. Also, the more we push God out and push God away, the more we're going to see God giving us what we've asked for. And it doesn't mean he's not God. It doesn't mean he's not powerful enough to stop it. God has given us free will choice. This is what you want to choose. Ultimately, okay, then I'm going to give you that. And truthfully, if you had had a voluntary prayer service at that school in that morning, even if you've been allowed to it, many of those students still wouldn't have come. I'm not blaming the victim. I'm blaming the shooter on this. However, we have told God we don't want you a part of this, and then we wonder why these places are targets. It's because what the enemy says is, well, that's fine. I'll do this. And so that's what we have to understand is we're going to have to get hearts to change and to turn, and the only one who can do that, because he is the supreme and the perfect example, is to follow the example of Christ. Christ allowed his disciples to have weapons because of protection's sake, because of he knew what they were going to face and the persecution that they were going to face in even furthering the gospel with his impending death. He's been dead now for 2,000 years. We still have a right to be able to have that because, again, these governing laws are in authority, but we have to be responsible with them. As with everything, if we take something and operate the way Christ would operate it, it will end righteously. The issue is that that's not what's going on, and this is what we get.
Right. Now I got a question.
Sure.
Because, all right, so now say we do some other things. So we increase police officers on schools, say we put in metal detectors, so when you come through the school, you got to do X, Y, Z.
Right.
You know, we up the ante. Say we even do find a way to get rid of the gun laws and stuff like that. Is it still safe to say that, well, it is still safe to say that these things still are going to happen, though, because just the way of the world that we live in. And so with that being the thing, it's like, you know, as I'm looking at it, and this is tough, but it's really hopeless apart from God.
It is.
And that's a really tough thing, because if I'm an unbeliever and I'm listening to what we're saying, I'm sitting here thinking like, man, if I don't come to Christ, or say I keep doing it my way, say you want to keep rejecting God and you just listen to what we're saying, where are you pulling hope from? Because say we do all these things, like, there's still evil and sin in the world, so you're still going to have these consequences. This is what we were talking about last week too. Like, what people don't understand, I don't care how much you want to talk about social issues or how much you want to say we need to do X, Y, and Z. If the message is not Christ, you can forget about it. And that's a tough pill to swallow unless you would Christ. You know, it's truly hopeless apart from it. It's hopeless.
And here's the thing about that, because we have talked about it. They've done a protest this week, and
don't mean nothing.
It didn't do anything. It didn't change anything.
Doesn't mean anything.
As a matter of fact, while I appreciate the effort, if you look at the effort was futile outside of the fact that, okay, it drew some attention, but you left a place that you said was not safe to go outside, to be honest with you, that was to put yourself in a position that was less safe, to protest the lack of safety in this building, only to return back to said building for the rest of the week that you're saying wasn't safe. Now, we could, listen, here's the thing. You go into Iraq, you go into Iran, at their airports, they got guys they got military personnel standing on top of buildings with M16s. Does America want that look? Probably not. But I don't really hear of any terroristic acts going on in those airports. Is that necessarily an answer? No. America has great freedom, and that's one of the things I love about it. But with great freedom comes great responsibility. And to Austin's point, there is no hope apart from Christ. Because what is going on now is that even if you think that your protests, you lobbying your senators and your congressmen and women, you're lobbying, the president, you doing all of these things, and that's still not going to change the heart of somebody who is bent on causing massive destruction to other human beings. Coming to Christ, though, is the one who can change a heart from somebody being a mass murderer to being a mass evangelist. And that becomes the component that has to be, but we've said that's not the answer we want, but that's the only answer there is. So it doesn't matter if you answer the question to 2 + 2 and say it's 5 or 6 or 7. There's a lot of numbers you can choose, but the only answer is 4. And Jesus Christ is still the only answer until hearts change and all of that. Now, what I mean by that is not somebody who goes in to a church or somewhere else and blows up something or shoots somebody and says, well, I was a Christian, I went to church. No, but your actions, your character don't look like Jesus Christ. So even at that, that's part of the issue. But as long as there is sin in the world, we're going to be faced with these kinds of consequences. As long as there is a disrespect of the Almighty God and His Son, Jesus Christ, there's always going to be these kind of consequences in the world. And so that's what we've done, and we put ourselves in a position by doing that, and so we get these consequences that result. Now, one of the interesting observations that we made in this is that we have to begin to look at this from God's perspective. You know what I mean? So God's perspective is, okay, look, I've given you all the answer. I've told you all how to live. I've given you the perfect example in Jesus Christ, but yet you want to live contrary to that. Well, as with any parent, if I cannot allow for certain behaviors to continue to go on, because then it appears that I condone it. And so part of that is to also, you made a great point in what you were saying earlier, which is perhaps even in this one incident that God, And I do want to give some comfort to the parents and everybody else with that too later on as we talk about this, because I definitely don't want to be harsh in that.
Right.
But God will use a situation like this to evangelize, to remind us that we need to turn to Him. Because I do find it very interesting, September 11th in this country, people who fought against prayer in schools and prayer in government buildings stood together, locked arms in arms, and were calling upon the name of Jesus. I see a lot of crosses at memorials for these kids at this school. So at some point, maybe God sits back and says, if I take 17 children that weren't going to live forever anyway on this earth, to hopefully, to at least get the attention of 17 billion people, that out of that 17 billion, perhaps 170,000 will turn to me. Right. Then what the 17 would even tell you, that was worth it. Right. We got to look at this from God's perspective, because here's the thing. God in His sovereignty might say those 17 were sacrificed. And because I'm God, I can make the sovereign choice to place them on a new earth when there's a new heaven and a new earth. I'm not saying that's what God's going to do. What I am saying is God can make a sovereign choice regarding those 17 on Judgment Day. Right. But here's what I do know. God will sacrifice human life for the sake of the souls of many. If you don't believe me that's why Christ had to be fully human and fully divine. He was the ultimate sacrifice for the good of many. Mm-hmm. God throughout, even with Israel, God allowed, even when David took a census, there were still people who died for the sake of getting their attention. Right. You walk and look at the journey of some of the people of God and how some lives were taken for the sake of the many. Yeah. So what we need to do is heed and hear the voice of God in this and say, wait a minute. Our children are being murdered. There's something real wrong with that. Right. What is my contribution to these kinds of things? No, it's not the bullets. It's not the guns. That's the mechanism by which it's used. But here's the thing I do want people to understand. I've never seen a gun that's loaded. First of all, I've never seen a gun not be loaded by a human being. Second of all, I've never seen a gun shoot itself without a human being. So perhaps the issue isn't the gun. The issue has to rest with the human being, right? Yeah. Okay. Interesting dynamic that God gave Austin and I and Colin before this show. Believe it or not, the atheist and the Christian come to the same location on this issue. The atheist says, there is no God, I don't believe in God, God don't exist. Okay, atheist, then who do you blame for this that goes on? You can't blame the gun, it didn't shoot itself. Can't blame the bullets, they didn't put themselves in there. They didn't make themselves either. Oh, we got to come back to the human being and the shooter. As a Christian, I say, well, wait a minute. I can go and say that there's sin, but who sinned? Humans. Who did that? Who's God going to hold responsible? The shooter. Yes, there are some things we could do as human beings to put up other parameters in light of the fact that we live in a sinful world, but we all come back to the same place. The first person we got to blame is the shooter. Mm-hmm. Are there other things that have gone on and done? Where the atheist and the Christian will certainly depart, because the atheist will still say, no, I don't want prayer to Christ in school. The Christian has to say, but man, we gotta make some things. I'll say it like this. My grandfather, who I did his eulogy here the other week, 99 years old, Saul Knighton Sr., great man. One of the things that he would say is, prayer went out of schools and the guns and drugs came in. That's not coincidence. That's actually just the way the divine order works. Right. If you eliminate God, then again, you eliminate the propensity for righteousness, right? And so the word even says in Proverbs that righteousness exalts a nation, but sin will destroy any people. Yeah. Yeah. So we got to ask ourselves the question, America. It says, blessed is a nation whose God is the Lord. Not many gods, not coexisting, not any of that. Whose God is the Lord. It says, blessed is that nation. America is living under blessings because at one time, America was a Judeo-Christian God. Didn't always live up to it. You don't believe me? Ask slave masters, ask minorities, ask women. Didn't always live up to the character of it, but it still had it as a foundation. Right. But it says this, and God doesn't discriminate. Righteousness exalts a nation. All I'm going to ask the question is, You think America is operating in the righteousness of God? It says, but sin will destroy any people. So sin don't discriminate in its destruction, and righteousness will exalt whomever exalts the righteous one, right, that being Jesus Christ.
Right. Thank you for watching the Put the Word on It podcast. Please email us any questions or topics you'd like us to discuss to the email below. We'll see you on the next show.